Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this very interesting and important session where we are going to reflect on the values of capitalism. And to do so, we have with us a very eminent and distinguished panel. With us, we have President Shimon Peres, President of Israel. We have Mr. Tony Blair, former Prime Minister of the United Kingdom and the current envoy of the Middle East Quartet. We have Ms. Indra Nooyi, who's the Chairman and Chief Executive of the Chief Executive Officer of PepsiCo. I have Mr. Stephen Green, who's the Chairman of HSBC. I also have Mr. James Schiro, Group Executive and Chairman of the Board of Zurich Financial Services, and Jim Wallis, Editor-in-Chief and Chief Executive of Sojourners. Let me kick off the session by quoting something that Robin Reich has written in his book, Supercapitalism. And I quote, he says, "Stories about heroic or villainous CEOs and financiers, brilliant or corrupt politicians, or diabolically powerful merchants of ideas, however gratifying they may be, should be surrendered to reality. Although a few of these figures have been especially insightful or particularly unscrupulous in terms of the big picture, their deeds are almost completely beside the point. The changes at issue here are structural, not personal." So, with that in mind, I think one of the things we need to consider today is whether or not we are happy with the rules of the game. We are happy with the values we have set and the rules by which we are measuring ourselves. What are the values that define our common humanity? That surely must be the question we consider as we consider the values of capitalism. Gathered here in Davos are the leaders of the largest corporations on our planet, the heads of state of many countries, politicians, heads of NGOs and representatives of civil society, and all of us as citizens of nationally and globally. I think we all have a responsibility to ask whether or not we are living by the right values. And so we need to ask also whether we have collectively, nationally and globally the right institutions, and whether those institutions have set the right rules. And having set those rules and having put those institutions in place, whether we, both as citizens and as nations, respect the institutions sufficiently to adhere to the rules that have been set. Whether or not we care enough about each other to follow the prescripts and the rules that have been set and the values by which we want to live. I think those are the questions that are before us at this critical point, where as a globe and as the global economy we face perhaps an unprecedented crisis, even as we heard yesterday, yet another revision of global GDP, bringing global GDP down to the lowest it's been in 60 years. So clearly a major crisis. We know that capitalism is a system that we believe delivers, but does it have, at the current point, does it have the right values? And to reflect on that, let me turn to Tony Blair. Tony, you've been doing a significant amount of work and a lot of reflection on whether or not we have the right values. Let me start with you and ask, what are your views on this?
Right. First of all, good morning, everyone. Especially in and around a conference like this, lots of people want to say, well, is it kind of the end of capitalism, end of the free market system? There's an old friend of mine who I bumped into a short time ago who was with me in my university days when I used to be, believe it or not, very left-wing and out doing the protests with a whole lot of other friends, most of whom became investment bankers. He was the one who stayed true to the faith all the way through, and I bumped into him the other day and he said, I told you capitalism was going to end. There's naturally a point of reflection as to what about the system, which I think is intelligent to do. And my reflection is really very simple, that this is a new world, but actually we've been taught a very old lesson, which is that values matter. And I think the importance of values in this debate is that whatever regulatory system, and I'm sure we will devise a fantastic regulatory system for the future that will make sure that the crisis we've just had does not recur, because that's what we do with regulation. We regulate for the last crisis. But actually, irrespective of the system of regulation, there's a limit to that, and we do need to reflect on what are the values that underpin this system. And I'd just like to make 2 points arising out of that. The first is that the old lesson we've been taught is that the best self-interest is enlightened self-interest. In other words, the best free enterprise is actually stakeholder free enterprise, where it's not just about the maximisation of short-term profit, but where there's a sense of long-term value, confidence, transparency, openness, where there's a sense that the financial system is at the service of the wider economy, and the wider economy is at the service of the wider society, rather than the financial system simply being an end in itself. Now, I think, frankly, that that is really quite an old lesson, but it's one that we've relearned very painfully. And so going forward, my concept of the values underpinning the free enterprise system, because again, let's be absolutely clear about this, the free enterprise system as a whole has not failed. The financial system has failed. The free enterprise system as a whole has not failed. And we've got to be careful of the lessons we draw out of that. But I take it that what we can derive from the painful experience we're going through is that what I would call loosely a concept of stakeholder capitalism, in other words, where there's a concept of the wider interest as well as the narrow corporate or profit maximisation interest, is an essential and important part of how we move forward into the future. That's the first thing, enlightened self-interest. The second is this, and this is where this crisis, to my mind, is new. It's global in its impact. I mean, it's not that credit bubbles and asset inflation bubbles are unknown in the course of human or economic history. We've had them before. The difference now is that we're in a globally integrated economy. And my second thought and reflection would be this, that part of the problem that we have today is that the integration of the world, not just economically, but in many ways politically, has moved far ahead of the political capacity to express that integration, either institutionally or in terms of the alliances that we have. And let me just say very briefly what I mean by that. For example, it now, I think, would seem quite bizarre to talk about the G8 as being the place where the leading economies of the world come together and decide things. We have moved almost in the space of a few months to an idea where the G8 that happens in Italy this year, in my view, would be unthinkable unless it involved a broader number of countries than simply the members of the G8. In international financial regulation, it is plain there is going to have to be international coordination. And if you just take one aspect of the challenges for the new American administration, in my view, as important as anything else is getting the right strategic relationship between the US and China. Why? Because unwinding some of the imbalances is going to be a fundamental part of making sure the world economy works in the future. I would therefore say that my second reflection is that in this globally integrated economy and increasingly globally integrated society, we need also a shared purpose and shared values and institutions that express those. And my reflection is simply this. Globalization, which I actually, in terms of the integration of the economy and societies I support, cannot work unless it's based on clear shared values. And those values have to have within them the component of justice. The reason why I think Africa is a vital issue is not just for Africa, not just for the people in Africa, but also because what we do about Africa, what we do about its plight, what we do about poverty and deprivation in the world is an essential expression of our belief that we are indeed one global community and owe a responsibility to others. So my reflection on values and capitalism is this. We need to revive a concept of free enterprise that is about enlightened self-interest and a stakeholder concept of capitalism. And secondly, in this new globally integrated economy, we need a globalization based on values, otherwise it will not be effective. And if we want to move forward in a way that deals with the current economic problem and gives us the best chance of success in the future, then we are going to have to work not just for a more prosperous world, but a more just world, and indeed link those two concepts together. Those are my beginning reflections. Thank you.
Thanks, Tony. I want to come back to some of the points you made, because a lot of underlying some of what you've said comes back to a core value and of leadership too, and that's the value of courage. Courage to make the right choices and courage to take decisions and when those decisions need to be taken. But before I ask you to come back into the discussion, I'm going to ask Stephen to come in, because Stephen, you head up one of the largest financial institutions in the world, and a lot of what's happening now, as Tony himself has just indicated, has been put at the door of the banking sector, is that I don't want us to spend too much time on debating whether that's right or wrong and fair or not fair, but I do want to ask you to comment on how we changed the values that have driven the system to this point. So much of what has happened has been driven by the incentives that have been in place. So how do those incentives change? And as leaders, when we're faced with the wrong incentives, what do we do about it?
Really, thank you. And building on the wider scene, I think Tony has painted the broader canvas very vividly. I am going to focus on the narrower question of what goes on inside the financial system, and particularly big financial institutions. I'd like just to pick up on the words you quoted, and forgive me, I forget who it was who said them, and the comment you cited, that this is structural and not personal. Well, in one sense it's right, but in another sense I don't agree. It is, of course, partly structural, but it's very importantly about values. This is something that Tony has already put fair and square on the table. This is about the values that had developed in the markets in recent years. One way of putting it is that it's as if we have moved from the old cliches that talked of my word is my bond in the markets through to a culture, an atmosphere in which it was almost as if you would say to yourself, if there's a transaction and there's a market for it and it's legal and I've got a contract, then that's it. I don't need to ask any other questions than that at all. I will just do it. I don't need to think about any underlying sense of right and wrong, unsuitability, suitability, and so forth. And I believe we've lost something very precious as a result of that move. This is not something that was a step function change. You can't point to a particular time when this shift occurred. This is more, to use the image of the boiling frog, it is something that gradually happened, and you kind of, only when it's happened do you realize how far we've traveled. But that's very much part of the issue. The point of making that point is this. We will unquestionably need to overhaul the regulatory environment for banks and financial institutions generally. There are unquestionably lessons that need to be learned about the rules under which the market operates. and those are being studied carefully. I think there are issues in the famous Basel II capital adequacy framework that we need to look at. There are issues about accounting. There are issues about regulatory supervision of liquidity. All those kinds of things need to be thought through, and the detail needs to be looked at very carefully. But at the end of the day, no amount of rules are going to enforce good behaviour. No amount of rules is going to get that value system right within the system, and that is essential to sustainable, flourishing capital markets. This is important because it's important, but it's important also because sustained economic development in the world depends crucially on a well-functioning capital market. The one lesson that we must not learn from the current financial crisis is that we can somehow turn the clock back and do without the international capital markets. The principal casualties of going down that route will be the emerging markets of the world. The principal casualties will be poorer countries that depend on foreign direct investment, that depend on international capital movements. So we have to get this right, and we have to move forward. There are a lot of structural issues that are thrown up by this, but I don't want to lose sight of the very important question of values. Again, Tony said it, but I want to reinforce it. Values are important to shareholder value. Values in the institution, I believe, are the key to long-term, sustainable, successful development of the business. We have to grow our profits. We're not charities, we're not NGOs, we are commercial businesses, so we need profit growth. But our job is to do that sustainably over a period of time, and in order to do that, we need to think about our wider social responsibilities. We need to think, even in the narrow commercial world, about the kinds of questions that Tony has tabled, and we need, importantly, to think about the ways in which we do the business, the culture within the company. So there's a clear responsibility, therefore, on the boards of companies, the top managements of companies. It translates into some specific issues about compensation. Maria has alluded to that. I think very clearly now there's an atmosphere. The time is now right. The time is now open for a much more responsible approach to compensation than has been often manifest in recent years. So I am actually optimistic, if that isn't too daring a word at the moment. This too will pass, but it's not going to pass in the sense of bouncing back to the way things were. It shouldn't pass in the sense of bouncing back to the way things were, but this is an opportunity to get a few things right that have gone wrong and ensure that international free market-based capitalism can deliver the goods for the world at large for the next generation. Maria, thank you.
Thanks, Stephen. I think I hear you, and Indra, if I can turn to you, because when in every single company I know has a values and ethics statement. We all publish sustainability reports, and as CEOs and as boards of companies, we all sign off on those, and we all are obliged, I suppose, to live by the things we say in those ethics statements and in those value statements. And yet we have to ask ourselves, what has failed? Is it that we have not defined the behaviors appropriately? Is it that when things have failed, we have not had the courage to behave appropriately? Are the sanctions associated with failure not high enough? What has failed in the system?
Maria, thank you. I must tell you, it's almost embarrassing to be on a panel which is debating this notion of values, because I represent a Main Street company. And as a CEO of Main Street company, I think we've been tainted by the issues that have been created by the other street. And I think that's a real tragedy, because we are guilty by association, which is not a very nice place to be. But let me start off by saying that the worst thing that can happen is that we start questioning the notion of capitalism, because capitalism is good. Capitalism powers countries. Capitalism is what unleashes innovation. And capitalism works as long as three elements work within it. And it's this tension and check and balance that each of these three elements have on each other that makes for good capitalism. And if anything falls apart of these three issues, then you get greed and bad capitalism. And let me talk about this. Capitalism is about generating the surplus, And the surplus is moderated by competition, by personal morality and ethics, and by regulation, just laws and regulation. Let's start with competition. Competition always works so that it knocks the surplus out of the system, but when competition is tempered or stopped because there's lack of transparency or obfuscation of the facts, then that results in greed, which is what happened with the other street in the recent months. But then one would hope that when competition is not really open, you have personal morality and ethics that takes over. Now, there's a very fine line between fraud and lack of judgment or poor judgment. And, I've debated many times with bankers. They'd say that what happened on Wall Street is lack of judgment or poor judgment and not fraud. But you know what? I'm not going to debate that anymore. It's not worth it. But the fact of the matter is, when personal morality and ethics falls apart, then this whole notion of the enterprise is questioned and capitalism comes into question. And it's not the laws that you have on the books, but how you comply with those laws that's important. So it's the moral order, not the legal order, that has to prevail. And in fact, if you look at those countries that are law-abiding and those countries that are not law-abiding, all countries have a lot of laws on their books. It's the compliance with the laws that makes a difference. And I think what we've had is the notion of the almighty buck that won over personal morality and ethics that resulted in a lot of the issues that we have today. And I think that has to be brought in balance. But the third thing that brings all of this into balance is innovation and is regulation. When innovation gets ahead of regulation, you have a problem. And I think what happened is that in the recent crisis, innovation got ahead of regulation. Why did innovation get ahead of regulation? I mean, capitalism spurs innovation. That's good. But when you have regulators who are not paid as much as they should be to keep up with the innovation, clearly you don't have that third dimension providing the check and balance. All that I'd say is that 90% of Main Street or 100% of Main Street has got great values and is working fine. The other part of the economy needs some work. Needs some work on competition, needs some work to re-examine personal morality and ethics, needs a lot of work on innovation, on making sure innovation is a step ahead of regulation. It means getting the right people into the regulatory agencies so that they're paid well and they can keep up with all the innovation that's going on. But my request is, this is not the time to over-regulate one part of the industry, that you understand, just to make a stand that you've put something in place to answer the crisis that's going on today. We don't want a repeat of what happened after the 1930s when over-regulation stopped everything. I think it's time to challenge corporations to examine their personal morality and ethics and whether they truly believe that what's good for corporations has to be good for society and what's good for society is good for corporations. I think we've got to challenge companies to think about performing with a sense of purpose, not just performing for short-term shareholder interests.
Thanks, Indra. President Perez, you've said recently that the crisis happened because we are rich with funds, and I think you said either short of ideas or poor with ideas. Now that so many are depleted of funds, do you think we're going to have an abundance? We're going to be much richer with ideas?
Thank you very much. For me it's not the first time to participate in the Davos gathering. But this gathering is different from all the previous one, because this is a very kind invitation to the most important pessimists of our time to attend the party in honor of a crisis of an unknown nature. This is a crisis because we are going to die or because we are going to give birth. So we gathered around the magic mountain, and to see who is the greater pessimist among us, I must say I got private permission from Schwab to remain an optimist, and I don't have to change my dress. Now, when I'm looking, Keynes has said that economy is a matter of concepts. And actually what we are talking about, ideologies, those are different economic concepts. Capitalism, communism, social democracy, liberalism. And each of them has its own preference and its final failure. Let's start with communism. The communists wanted to prefer equality upon freedom. They have exaggerated so much that they took away freedom, but they didn't create equality. It became more slaves than equal people. I think from that point of view, Henry Ford did better than Lenin, because Henry Ford made from workers customers, and Lenin made from them subjects without much room to maneuver. I think that social democracy is a wonderful idea based on justice and really distribute freedom and equality and wealth. But again, I'm afraid, and Tony and myself happen to be the same group, we exaggerate too, because we wanted to give as quick as possible, as much as we can think of, to every person for doing as little as he should. So the welfare state follows gain. Then we are exaggerating now with private initiative. They says, let's have competition, let's give the private people a free hand, full permissiveness, and the result was the success killed the successful people. They exaggerated, they thought that they are really great managers, and they can exaggerate in making money. They made so much money and much of it imaginary, so they distributed with a light heart until these two exaggerations brought them to failure. And it has nothing to do with the concept, it has to do more with the implementation and the management. When I look about all those different schools of thought, I believe that maybe we have to think a little bit differently, because all those economic theories and ideologies are economists how to distribute wealth. Maybe we have to try to think not how to distribute wealth, but how to create wealth. We have more people than ever before in history, more needs. We don't know enough about the nature. Science is a fight against blindness. We didn't know much about the world we live in. And we have to educate ourselves, and every time we discover something, our life is being changed. Globality is a matter of fact as a result of the change from going over from the land to science. Land has borders, science does not. Land can be defended by armies, science cannot be conquered by police. It's free, it's floating, and by the way, it's not necessarily a matter of companies. The world is both global and individual like never before. A single man can create such an important economic strength which is unbelievable, like Gates, like the Google. You don't need a great corporation, you need a great idea. And I think the coming years, the coming 10 or 20 years, will be a shift from dividing what we have to producing what we need. The difference between nature and industry is, in industry you build, in nature you grow. In industry you collect different materials, iron and wood and water, and you build from top to bottom. In nature you take a small seed that becomes a child or a tree, and then a forest, and then a man, and then humanity. It grows all the time. I think, by the way, with the introduction of nanotechnology, when we know now the components of growth, maybe we can begin to make things grow too, because theoretically, if you can with 6 kilo of plutonium to destroy a city, you can with 6 kilo of plutonium to build a city. They have the same energy. You destroy it because to destroy, you don't have to see the atoms. You can do it blindly. To construct, you have to control them. And I do believe there will be industries of construction. I can see, in my judgment, at least 5 new tremendous industries, and they don't depend, all of them, on the banks and the capital. They really depend on ideas. And that's why I've said we have more money than ideas. I shall mention them briefly. I think they're more or less agreed. The first is to produce alternative energy. The oil is polluting. The oil is distributing wrongly the money. If you make the cost of a barrel of oil $143 and you force a poor farmer in Africa to pay 14 times more than 10 years before for no reason, because oil is not being produced, oil is being discovered. There is no reason to increase the cost 14 times. It's crazy. And then, unfortunately, oil is supporting terror, either because they're afraid of the terrorists, so they pay the money, or because they like terror, thinking that this is an instrument to being great, and they spend money on it. And there are limits to oil as well. While we have a sun, totally free, objective, permanent, not political, and a quarter of an hour of the sun is sufficient enough to supply all the energy we need for a year. We need the instrumentation and the mechanics to do it. I talk about how to produce new situations. To produce is also to stop the tremendous waste. I want to give you one example for my own country, Israel. Israel never was taken by the ideologies of division because we have nothing to divide. The land was poor, no natural resources. So our ideology was not to distribute, but to build from the beginning. And we're still continuing to build and paying also the cost of defense. I shall take one item which is essential even for the development of Africa, and that is fresh water. You cannot hail the Africans without providing them with running fresh water. And so 2/3 of the globe is covered with water. Only 1% of the available water is drinkable water. We have dry land. We have one river, the Jordan River, who is more famous in its public relations than in the amounts of water which is taking place there. And what we did is try first of all to save water. We saved by now, and we offered to all our friends, we can save 50% of the water which is necessary for drinking and irrigation, particularly for irrigation. We introduced one system which is called the drip irrigation that saved 20% of the water, and it's now becoming popular all over the world, in China and India. The latest development, we have also decided to control irrigation electronically. What we do, we take a computer, we attach it to the tree, the computer measures the dryness of the tree and how much water does it need. We save another 30% of the water. Saving 50% of the water is the cheapest water we can have, and we can distribute twice as much as we did until now. Then with the old pipelines, there is a great deal of evaporation. Now, before you begin to produce expensive water, you can double the water by trying to introduce a different approach. So I think it's energy, it's water. I think a great industry, tremendous one, is going to be developed around the stem cell. People will have spare parts. They can enlarge their life expectancy to be healthier. President Bush put an embargo upon it, and the new president lifted the embargo. I think it will become a great industry. The fourth industry that I believe is teaching. We are short of teachers. and the teachers are short of information. I'm not talking about values. Values don't change, but chemistry and physics are changing every 7 years. And you'll find in many classes where the children are better informed than the teachers. I know in my family, my children know more than I do. They watch the internet, they watch television. And for that reason, the teachers are in trouble. I think they can continue to teach values. They can continue to help to build the personality of the student. But to be up to date, or shall I say, to be up to more, you need a technology. And we can develop a technology for teaching almost all the children in new ways. I think it's a tremendous opportunity, and I think education is the greatest wealth we have, and the best way to distribute the wealth, which is knowledge, to everybody concerned. And then we have the problem of terror and home security. I think there are measures to make life safer in the banks, in the hotels, in the schools, without harming anyone. By the way, the basis of all those 5 industries should be nanotechnology. It enables you to have new material, new systems, new sizes, new compositions. And I say, leave the old system. Why go to produce the same cars when you can produce a car, an electric car, that consumes only 40% of the oil, and we have to save our environment? So he says, crisis in the eyes of many people sounds like an end. I think crisis can sound like a beginning as well.
Okay. Well, on that...
Just on the thing, but even when you talk about science and economy, I think the greatest document in the domain of economy are still the 10 Commandments. It should help all of us. Thank you.
On that note, perhaps we can, on the note of the 10 Commandments, I think I was going to ask James, but I think it's probably more appropriate to move to Jim. Jim, you before we came in here, you and I were having a discussion about what is the common good, and whether or not our values are truly reflective of that common good, and whether this is more than a structural change and really a spiritual change, and whether out of this crisis will come some form of spiritual renewal that will be reflected in the values we choose. And I come from a part of the world where we hold on to a philosophy of Ubuntu. Mm-hmm. Which is, I suppose, in an environment like this, translates into the common good. So maybe you want to reflect a little bit on that, since President Perez ended on the 10 Commandments. I thought it would be appropriate to move to you.
Well, as one of the handful of religious leaders in Davos, it was suggested I just call for a moment of silence and do a closing prayer after our conversation. But let me just say, every morning when I wake up in my hotel room these days, I turn CNN on, and there's an interviewer who has CEOs all bundled up outside behind the Davos winter, and they're trying to stay warm, and he asks them one question. He says, when will this crisis end? And they all must give their answer. Then there's a whiteboard, and he puts their answer on the whiteboard. I want to suggest that is the wrong question. Now, we all want to know when the crisis will end, but the question should be, how will this crisis change us? That's the right question. Change the way we think, the way we make decisions, change our habits of the heart, change how we do business. Because I think, indeed, this is a structural crisis, but it's also a spiritual crisis. It calls for social regulation, as has been said, but also a new kind of perhaps self-regulation. We have trusted the invisible hand so much that we have forgot to bring virtue to bear on our decisions. And so the invisible hand has let go of some important things, like the common good. I love Ubuntu, the way Desmond Tutu speaks of that. It is the notion of the common good, and the common good has not been very common in our decision-making about economics for a long time. I'm reminded of what Mahatma Gandhi said. He called them the 7 deadly social sins, and they diagnose our moment. Here's what Gandhi said. The 7 deadly social sins are politics without principle, wealth without work, commerce without morality, pleasure without conscience, education without character, science without humanity, and worship without sacrifice. The first session I was at here this year, yesterday morning, was over in Zurich, the small little room. It was helping others in this post-crisis world. It was a powerful session. It was about social enterprise, and it was about philanthropy and how we need to rethink the purpose of business. It was a wonderful conversation, but I suggested it was in a very small room, and it wasn't full. The conversation should have been here in the main hall. And so I suggested to all those there, very creative people, social entrepreneurs, I said, your mission is to infiltrate the World Economic Forum. So they began to call yesterday the Zurich subterfuge here. And it was striking to me how that in that conversation, the social conscience of business was there. It's always been here at Davos. But I would suggest that the social conscience of business has been a sidebar. A sidebar. Maybe an extracurricular activity. I teach at Harvard sometimes, and I'm told that at the business school, the courses on business ethics are the most heavily subscribed. But the professors of those courses feel their courses are peripheral to the mission of the business school. How do we take the sidebar and make it mainline? How do we make it a guiding principle? I would just conclude with this. If this crisis doesn't change us, then all the pain and all the misery it will create will be in vain. The people who do numbers in Washington, D.C., who I trust, tell me 10 million more Americans are about to be plunged into poverty. That's just in my country. Around the world, it'll be much worse. The only way to redeem the pain and the misery of this crisis would be if the crisis changes us. How will this crisis change our whole way of operating? And how will, perhaps, a reestablishing of the common good from the World Economic Forum infiltrate and be the subterfuge in the global economy? Thank you.
Thanks, Jim. James, I want to turn to you because yesterday at the International Business Council, we had a discussion around self-regulation and governance. And it was quite an interesting discussion. And coming out of that discussion, there were some issues that we thought were relevant on the issue of values that we thought we might want to share with the audience today. And I thought that as you are on the International Business Council, you might want to share that with the audience. but they were also relevant because they go to some of the issues that were raised, I think, by Tony Blair and some of the other panelists around issues of regulation and what the regulatory environment might look like into the future, but also around capitalism and why it is important that we create this, that we sustain the system, but that we inject into it a different kind of dynamism and reflect the common good.
Okay, thank you very much. And look, we've had a lot of rich topics discussed here, and I'm mindful that we all come into this world with a clean slate, and through the living we build an individual and collective reputation, and it isn't a function of what the values are that we should debate or discuss, because I think no matter which society that you look at or which system that you look at, there's a form of values. No one promises anyone misery and heartache and expects them to follow them. So it really comes down to delivering at the end of the day on what you promise. And I think when we look at where we are today, it's a matter of disappointing people and that we didn't deliver on what we promised and brought them to the state that we're in. And that's the sense of loss of trust, loss of credibility, and loss of reputation. I think it's incumbent upon all of the parties. I don't think that you can look and say it's the business community, it's government, it's the NGOs. We all have to say we apologize. We could spend a lot of time looking at this process, but I think we have to look forward and say what are the solutions going forward. And restoring trust and credibility is not an event, it's not a speech, it's not anything that any one person says, it's a process. And that's some of what we discussed yesterday at the Council in terms of self-regulation. My concern when I look at the solutions as we go forward here around self-regulation or government regulation, we do need, critically at this point in time, government intervention to stabilize. The danger that we have at the end of the day is that we get to the point of not knowing how to extricate ourselves from so much regulation in government institutions. The government should be good at running the government, and I'm not sure that the governments have the expertise at this point in time to run the businesses. And we have to make sure that as we get through this process, which I believe will be a long process, that we work at restoring confidence and restoring credibility. The question I have, when you listen to Jim and you listen to the others is, do we have the right leaders in the right jobs, whether they be in government or they be in business, with the right moral compass at this particular time and place to deliver at a very critical period? I think it would not be right to walk away from self-regulation alone at this point in time. I think we do need a new process and system of regulation. It is very clear that it's failed us. We did not assess the risks. We paid a very dear price because we were underpricing the risk that we were taking from a financial system. And we paid an even greater price by not living to the values that were inherent in the capital system that we have. So I think when we look out, the most important people in this process is the next generation. We have to make sure that whatever system we put in place does not stifle entrepreneurial spirit, creativity, and innovation. That is what drives our system. If you listen to President Perez, he talks about these new sciences that we need. We have to make sure that the system we put in place for the future allows us to be able to attract the right kind of talent, invest in the right kinds of places, and that we ensure that people we put in place have a moral compass and we hold them accountable at the end of the day to living to that.
Well, let me turn to Indra and ask, reflecting on what has been said, at the end of the day, we all, at all of the business schools, we teach students, and in organizations we teach, and we try and infuse the culture of the organization with the notion that the tone is set at the top. Mm-hmm. Do we really live by that standard? Is there sufficient of that consciousness in our organizations and in society? Because if there is, and how do we justify what has happened, and how do we reinforce the right kinds of behaviors and the values we've put in our system? And if we're serious about it, are we going to be serious in the way we forge this new set of values to be much more forceful about building that into the incentives into the future?
Maria, that's a very difficult question to answer. And the reason it's difficult is because, having talked to a lot of the bankers over the past few months, I don't think anybody believed they were committing fraud. I don't believe any of them felt like the tone at the top was not right. And no CEO of a big bank that's collapsed felt that they were embarking on a process of destroying the economy or the enterprise. I think if you don't have a check and balance with regulation, people looking over the shoulder, capitalism leads to a form of greed. And the line between surplus profits and greed is a fine line. And regulation is what decides where that line has to be drawn. And I'm going to come back and say, in a world where it's getting more and more global, when innovation is creating more exotic instruments, it's critical that regulation is not punitive, it's not overbearing, but you've got the right people who are lockstep, if not one step ahead of all the innovation that's going on in the marketplace. And we can talk about values, we can talk about tone at the top, we can talk about true north of all of the leaders. All of that's critically important. But you can't regulate tone at the top. You can't inject somebody with a serum that makes them have a true north all the time. It's something that comes from the inside. But it's the society and the checks and balances around you that make sure that you're seeing examples and behaving and staying on the true and narrow path. And to me, the regulatory framework and competition is what allows you to maintain that check and balance. So I'm going to come back and say we've got to examine the regulatory framework, the caliber of people that go into regulation, not people who get minimal wages and don't look at regulation as the most attractive job to go into. We've got to get the best and brightest to go there and figure out how to create a healthy balance between the three aspects that fuel capitalism, because at the end of the day, the death of capitalism is really putting an end to the progress of society. So I really don't want us to question the notion of capitalism at all. We should celebrate it even more so in the years going forward.
Okay. Jim, I see you shaking your head vigorously there. Is that in agreement?
Yes, I think we need a new moral compass, to be sure, but we need a new sense of metrics. How do we evaluate what we do? There's a fact that we need to deal with, which is half of the population of the world, 3 billion people, are living on less than $2 a day, which means they're just outside of this whole conversation, often don't even live under the rule of law. A friend of mine is a state senator, a young state senator from the state of West Virginia, a coal-producing state. He tells me a fascinating story. His father was a coal miner, and the miners would take down into the mines with them a canary, because the canary has a very vulnerable respiratory system. And when the air becomes toxic, the canary begins to choke and to wheeze, and it's a sign that the air is toxic for everyone. It's time to get up out of the mine as quickly as possible. So the canary becomes kind of a telltale sign of how unhealthy the air is for all of us. And it helped explain to me why in all of our faith traditions, the poor are often seen as a metric, because the poor are like the canary. when they begin to wheeze and choke, it's a sign that the air we're breathing, our environment, is toxic and not healthy for all of us. And they become the first sign of our toxicity. This crisis is caused in part because we didn't realize how toxic our culture, our environment was before it was too late. So how do we change our metrics and evaluate ourselves by a different set of standards here?
So Stephen, how do we change the metrics? What metrics should we have?
I think that there's a slight risk of a conclusion being drawn that it's either regulation or values. I don't think Indra meant that at all, but I wouldn't want it to come across that I think there's an alternative between the two. This is clearly a case of both and. There is no way that you can run a financial system or global capitalism as a whole without good regulation. It is not, by the way, as if the financial system has not had plenty of regulation. I come from a country where before Tony Blair fixed the problem, the railways were famously inefficient. And there's a story that had become legendary in London of a snowfall. And those of you who know London will know that if it ever snows, there's complete chaos. And the railways in particular bear the brunt of this. And there was a famous announcement on one of the London termini that the train had been late. And although they'd had the snow clearing equipment in place, this was, quotes, the wrong form of snow.
Exactly.
And I'm tempted to say that some of the regulation that's been around has been the wrong sort of regulation. So there's a real job to do to make sure that the regulation that's brought to bear on the financial services is effective regulation. But I do also want to insist very strongly that regulation is necessary but never sufficient. And without values within companies, regulation will not do the job for us. And values are about a whole series of things, and putting metrics on them is quite a challenge, actually. I think values it's a profoundly important responsibility of the leadership. Now, to be clear what I mean by leadership is of course from the top. In the case of companies, it's of course the board. I mean, I think boards should be asking for a presentation on the corporate culture as a standing agenda item at least, say, once a year. They should be looking for surveys of the engagement of the workforce, the colleagues around the world, and those surveys of engagement should be measuring people's views of what they want the company to be. Those should be done by independent survey consultants. These are the kinds of things that I think you do in the form of hard metrics. And I also think this is a matter of repetition. It is and of course, living what you say. And I think as a final point, leadership, although it's clearly leadership is the primary responsibility of those in senior leadership positions, but it is also a responsibility of everyone in the company. In the case of my company, we employ about 330,000 people around the world, and what I tell people consistently is that every one of those 330,000 people has a leadership responsibility. They may have nobody reporting to them on some organization chart, but they have the opportunity to influence, for better or for worse, their colleagues, clients, people in society, and therefore they have leadership responsibility. And the constant reinforcement of what that leadership means day to day is one of the most profoundly important tasks of the board and senior management.
Tony, we're coming to the end of this discussion, and we've got very strict rules that we must be out of here by 11:30. So I want to give you the last words. And I want to pick up on something you said in your introductory comments, and that was that we've come to a point where this crisis is so deep that it's no longer good enough to think that it can only be resolved, and the only voices that can be heard on this are the voices of the G7 or the G8 as it is now, but that we need a broader voice on this matter. And it comes to something that I think is at the core of values and leadership, and that is courage. Courage and respect. And I want to ask of you, as a former Prime Minister and as an eminent person, whether or not the leadership of the world has, and the political leadership, has the courage to make the changes in the global institutions that are required at this time, which I think virtually everybody knows are now needed. It is a point at which courage is needed. does the leadership have the courage to make those changes?
Yes. Yes. That's an optimistic statement. Well, I hope so. I mean, I've just got this thought as we conclude. I mean, I think what Stephen has just done is bring us back to what the specifics out of this, because I think everyone's agreed. Look, it's values and regulation, and the values need to be those that acknowledge the broader public interest. And I think Stephen put it very well. And incidentally, we should congratulate him as one of the few bankers willing to come out in daylight hours nowadays. So it's a great thing to see him here. But I think that when you get to specifics, I think these are the things. First of all, Stephen's absolutely right, and Indra and James Schiro have also said there are certain basic principles and values that should go throughout corporate life. And actually what we need to be thinking about from here, because it's not so long since I've been in government that I don't try to think of policy as well as merely philosophy, it's important that we work out how we would achieve this. Are there forms of dialogue that we should be having at a corporate level? Are there things that we should actually be doing in our business schools that mainstream such thoughts? So I think that's one aspect of it. And I think the second aspect is this, that it's really important we learn the right lesson and not the wrong lesson from this. The wrong lesson is that innovation, creativity, free enterprise are things that get us into this situation. What we really need is the state to come in and run things. Now, personally, I think the state has got a big role in putting this right, but it's not the answer moving forward. On the contrary, its purpose is to make sure that the free enterprise system works again in the way that it should. And in this regard, I just want to conclude with this point. It's really important as well. I mean, it's very easy. We can blame the regulators, the political leaders, the bankers and all the rest of it. I do believe one major aspect of this whole crisis is the fact that it is global. And actually, we do not, in responding to it, want to return to a closed view of the world. So I would say things that may seem counterintuitive to policymakers, when you talk about courage, they've got to stand up for. First of all, yes, it is true that in an economic crisis, people may put the environment lower down the agenda. Why not actually use the economic crisis and the fiscal stimulus and the investment to invest actually in the energies of the future, so that when the economy comes back up again, we don't go back to dependence on $100 a barrel oil. Secondly, why don't we understand that actually the right response to this crisis is not beggar my neighbour policies of protectionism? Why don't we in fact get the world leaders to come together and work out what could be worked out with the right will, which is a proper world trade deal that would expand the open market trading system and actually do an enormous amount of good, particularly incidentally for some of the poorest people in the world. And the third thing is this: why don't we decide that this is not the moment to cut aid and help for the poorest in the world, but actually the moment to say we are indeed one global community, so let us make sure that everyone, not just the few, have a stake in that community.
Ladies and gentlemen, we've come to the end of this very rich debate this morning, and I want to thank all of the panelists for their immense contribution, to thank you for coming, and no doubt this is something that is going to take up a lot of debate and reflection in the weeks and the days and weeks ahead. So thank you very much.